Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Amy Bell and her book, Life Sentence. This is a fantastic book. It's true crime. It's a very personal story for Amy. She's just one of the most delightful people I've ever talked to, and she was very open. Listen, it's a fantastic true crime book, and especially for those of you who are like, oh, I don't like true crime too much. Listen, it's fantastic. I'm telling you. I'm not going to sell it anymore. I don't need to. Let's just talk to Amy. And here we are, Amy Bell, Life Sentence, How My Father Defended Two Murderers and Lost Himself. Amy, thank you so much for coming on.
Brendan, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I love this book, and we're going to get into it, but I want to just do a little bit of background first so people know who you are. What's your actual day job when you're not writing these books?
Well, I'm actually a history professor, and my field of specialization is modern British history, and in particular, the history of war and the history of crime. So I did a book about 10 years ago on the history of homicide investigation and the history of forensics and police investigations in Britain.
Now, I know some people who are in higher ed teaching kind of these types of things. Now, in America, my understanding is higher education is a lot like Game of Thrones at times. Is it like that in Canada, or are you guys just nice about everything, including, the politics side of things?
Well, I have to say there are Canadian campuses where you do have a lot of infighting, but I'm lucky enough to work not only in a really supportive department where my colleagues are actually my close friends, but also in a very supportive community. Huron University College is an amazing place to work, and I couldn't be happier to be there.
Well, speaking of amazing, I like to do background, but you're not going on Twitter rants or anything like that, so I had to dig a little bit further, and I found your professor ratings from your students, and you're killing it.
Oh, good.
I didn't know what I was going to do if you were getting bad ratings, but they're fantastic. So I think you should keep going with this. I think the professor thing is working out for you.
Thanks.
All right, so let's jump into Life Sentence. This is a bit different type of true crime. Normally, I'd ask whoever I'm talking to, where'd you get the idea for this book? But I think that is pretty simply answered right off the bat, which is this is about your father taking a case of two Canadian murderers. Can you give me a little bit more background on that?
Well, my father had been a criminal lawyer in the 70s, which I knew growing up, and he had stopped practicing law, but I never really got the true story why. And in 2016, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I was going through his things looking for something else. And I came across these Polaroids of a man who had bruises on his face and chest and feet, showing them to the camera. And I had no idea what they were. I thought they were some cousin or random relative, and that's why he had kept these photos in his filing cabinet. And I took them into the hospital, and I showed them to him. I said, "Who is this?" And he said, "That's Ricky Ambrose. I defended him on a charge of murder 40 years ago, and I don't want to talk about it anymore." And I had no idea about any of this. And his friend was in the room, said, "Oh, don't you know about this? This is one of the most famous Canadian murder cases and the most famous in New Brunswick, and your dad was in the middle of it." And I had no idea. And so once people heard that I was interested in it, all kinds of people started talking to me about it. I talked to my dad a little bit about it more before he passed, and it became a way after he was gone to research this story and find out more about this part of his life that I didn't really know. And then, of course, as a historian, I got very interested when I'm looking at the kinds of chain of evidence and the history of the police investigation and the crazy things that were happening in this case. And eventually it became this book.
And before we get to the crimes, which I absolutely agree, there's quite a few times where I was reading going, wait, what? There's a lot of twists and turns. But before we get there, one of the things about the book that, you really put a pin in is that this case itself kind of changed your father. And this wasn't something like you said that he talked about, which, quick tangent for myself, my father was a Vietnam veteran. And I remember that was something that was basically off limits. Not in a way that, he was kind of pushing me off, but almost if I decided to get interested in that, he would tell a funny story or a very G-rated story and things like that and just kind of move on over. And it was just very interesting hearing what you said and reading it in the book about how there seems to be that paternal instinct to not go too far into things that maybe they can't deal with or they think you can't deal with. Was that hard for you in the beginning when it was just like, yeah, that's what this is, go away? Or was this just something that you're like, maybe I'll come back to this and see if he's willing to talk about it later? Or did you back right off and say, I'm not going to try and go after it anymore?
Oh, no, I didn't back off because he was in a hospital bed and I wanted to know. And I think with a lot of men of that generation, and certainly with him, he was very private and he saw it as part of his job as a lawyer to never talk about his cases because all that information was privileged, except for the few stories that he would trot out, but how he saved this one person in a funny way or something. But I had to know more about this. And it came out maybe about 2 weeks later where he was saying that he wished he'd never taken the case and that it destroyed his life and it ruined his marriage and it destroyed his career and really kind of hollowed him out as a person. And I became, I guess, fascinated with finding out why. How could you go from being really an ambitious, well-respected, middle-class lawyer, happily married with a prosperous practice, people in the community trust you and respect you, to go from that. And then because you're defending someone who is hated in the community, you get death threats. And ultimately you lose the case, but people don't want to associate with you anymore. And you lose your practice and your marriage falls apart because you spent 6 months on this case. And everything disintegrated around him. And he was never really able to pick the pieces back up again. And suddenly the things I knew about him from when I was old enough to understand, like that we were poor, we lived in a trailer, people didn't come by, my dad didn't really work, he wouldn't have guns in the house, he got very upset sometimes when you would say certain things. People came to him for legal advice all the time and he gave it to them free. That made so much more sense knowing the story of what he had been through.
Was the decision to kind of follow through and figure this stuff out easy to actually put it into a book and put it out into the world? Because it's different to know personally, but I know if I'm thinking about writing a memoir, A, no one's going to read it, but B, I think about all the people in my life and do they want their business out there? Is this something that we should put out there? Was this a tough decision for you to kind of open up, your own family life to the public?
It absolutely was, because if you look at higher education and academia, it's people who are mostly from prosperous sons and daughters of professors getting jobs. And so to come out and say, yeah, I grew up poor, we were on welfare sometimes, I had a really unhappy family life, like my family members died young, and there's alcoholism and depression, and it's just very personal things, not so much to do with me personally, but it explains so much about the person that I later become and the difficulties it was to kind of overcome that and to create a career and a family life of my own. So yes, I thought about it, and especially the family secrets. Like, in a way, I don't know if my dad would be happy that I was talking about this. In a way, I think he'd be very angry that I'd be telling these secrets. And in other ways, I think he'd be very proud that finally his story is out there, but it would certainly be mixed emotions.
So let's talk a little bit about the setting, because it's super important in understanding this crime and how it all happened. So where is this in Canada? What's it like around this time? So for the stupid American who has not been to Canada yet, I know that's terrible, please just give me an idea of the setting and the time frame here.
Well, in the 1970s, I would say that Moncton, where the story takes place, Moncton, New Brunswick, was like a lot of other kind of formerly rich industrial towns. So it had been a hub town. There had been a lot of railway building, a lot of manufacturing. And by the 1970s, all of that was pretty stagnant. And so you saw in the 1970s the beginning of drugs coming into Moncton. There were really two classes of people. There's the prosperous middle-class professionals. So there's a fancy seafood restaurant in town and some various fancy boutiques. And at the same time, there's an underclass of people who rarely have legitimate jobs. They survive by petty theft and drug dealing. They're always having scams and trying to kind of make their way. to try to, I guess, figure out a way to survive without a lot of employment opportunity. And the interesting thing about Moncton, I think in the 70s, is that both sides of the city come together in this story. Right? It's a side about people who have nothing, who are trying to get this get-rich-quick scheme of a kidnapping, and it just goes terribly, terribly wrong in such a way that brings the community together, but also horrifies it for years to come. So if you talk to someone from Moncton who was alive then, everybody remembers it, this very traumatic event, and certainly everyone has something to say about it.
This is going to sound super weird, but I can't think of another way to say it. This is almost two phases of crime. The second obviously becomes this horrible tragedy where two police officers are murdered. The first phase of the crime is a kidnapping, which, I can't think of a better way to say this, kind of goes well for everyone involved. I mean, as far as a kidnapping is concerned, it happens, and other than just catching the kidnappers before it actually happens, it actually goes okay. Can you tell me a little bit about just that phase? Because that was the first thing that pulled me in and said, man, this is going to get weird.
Well, and this is how my father first got involved in the first phase of it, which is it's almost comedic how it all unfolds. So the owner of this seafood restaurant, who's known as a wealthy man, his son and his mother, they all live in the same house. They go home after work. It's about 10 o'clock, and waiting for them inside are two masked men. And so they grab the grandmother and they tie her to the banister with masking tape. And then they take the son and take him out in the car and take him to various locations, but all the time being very nice to him. And the grandmother, she's pretty elderly, but it's just masking tape. So she gets free in about 10 minutes and then calls down to the restaurant, tells her son what's happened, that they've kidnapped him. The kidnappers phoned the restaurant at various times, making the ransom demands, giving instructions of where the ransom money should be dropped. There's at least 3 calls. And the police are involved. Someone else, the family doesn't call the police. Someone at the restaurant calls them. They're listening in on the calls. They mark some of the money. But in terms of intercepting any of this, they get nowhere. And so the drop-off takes place at about 4 a.m. And it's in a neighborhood of the city that this police force doesn't even have jurisdiction over. So the then chief of police decides it would be a good idea to take these policemen, have them take off their uniform hats and uniform coats, put on random civilian coats and hats, and put them out in civilian cars, give them a whole bunch of extra weapons, and then send them out in cars without radios. Some of them have radios, some of them don't, and there's no central communication, and nobody knows where anybody is. So the first problem is that they missed the drop-off. So by the time they get there, the ransom money's been handed over, the kidnappers have the money, and Raymond, the son, is in his dad's car. They're heading back to the restaurant. He's totally safe. And in fact, he never even identifies the kidnappers, although he spends all night with them, and they buy him fried chicken and Coke, and they put a ski mask on him. He takes off his mask to eat it, but he still never identifies them. And then the police don't know what to do. So they're at the drop-off point. Nobody's there. And so they decide to start just randomly checking cars. And then the 2 policemen, Bourgeois and O'Leary, are told to go and check out this Cadillac that's been seen driving with its headlights off. And they say, okay. And then everybody leaves. And then they all go back to the restaurant, and it's not till an hour and a half later that they realize that Bourgeois and O'Leary have not come home. They forgot them. And so at that point, all hell breaks loose. They have to notify the police force in whose jurisdiction they were, driving around armed in unmarked cars. They have no idea what's happening. It's too late. They set up roadblocks, but it's far too late for that. And they happen to catch Ricky Ambrose for something else. They stop him and search him, and they find some of the marked money on him, and he's arrested. So that's when my dad gets called in. And by the time he gets to Moncton, where he's being held, Ricky Ambrose has been beaten several times. My dad said, I thought they were going to kill him. I took those photographs so that if they did kill him, that I could provide them in evidence, and also to potentially use them to get him into a different prison to try to protect him in some way. And so it was a kidnapping charge. He was only charged with kidnapping. And the reason he's being beaten is because they're trying to find out where the missing policemen are. So then once the policemen are missing, then it becomes very different. The whole community is shocked because these are two upstanding members of the community. They have young children. They're well liked. They're involved in amateur sports. Like, they're just these great guys. No one can figure out what happened to them or how they could even be overpowered or where they might be. And it takes 3 days for their bodies to be found in the woods. And by that time, there's so much anxiety and mourning and sadness. Everyone, in hundreds of people from the community, have been out looking for them, 100-mile radius around the city. And then they are found, and it's a terrible tragedy. And it becomes a media circus. Some of the media reporting was just very intrusive on what was happening with the bodies themselves and the discovery of the bodies. And then my dad's in here suddenly involved in a murder case. And he already feels responsible for this man that's been beaten. He's never been involved in a murder case before. He's just there on legal aid. But because he's there, he decides he'll try to defend both Ambrose and the person that gets charged along with him. Hutchinson is the second person involved in the kidnapping. And that's how the second half begins.
I mean, it feels like a mashup of a Hollywood movie with this first phase, the kidnapping phase. It feels like a comedy, right?
Yes.
They kidnap this kid. They're nice to grandma. They're nice to the kid. It feels like a Canadian kidnapping, right? Like, Canadians are so nice, even they kidnap nice. And at the same time, you don't realize it as you're reading the book. At the same time, it's setting up the horror show that's coming.
Yes.
And I mean, especially that was the big moment where I'm like, what in the hell is going on, when they realize that 2 cops are missing. And I just think about things nowadays, especially, I was in the Army. If you were gone for 10 minutes, someone was going to notice and they were going to freak out. And for police officers, it's the same thing. You need to check in. You need to do all of these things, which that's just another vein that we'll kind of get to, which is this wasn't dealt with right in the first place. But I want to jump back to your dad wasn't, in town at that point, right? Like, he had to get called in from pretty far away. How did he specifically get pulled into this, especially when he's not actually living there?
Well, as far as I can figure out, and I don't know for sure, but I know that he had a general law practice in St. George, which is about, say, an hour and a half, 2 hours drive away, where he did estates and property and all the small town lawyer stuff. But he really liked criminal law. And so for friends of his or friends of friends would do small scale, mostly legal aid stuff in Moncton. And it was word of mouth. So, ask this guy to do it. He's reliable, or because he was very idealistic and very interested in cases to do with individual rights. And this was before the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which changed the kind of legal landscape of rights in Canada. So you had to work by precedent, but he was always, even from when he was a law student, publishing a column in the student newspaper about what to do if you're stopped by campus police, and, don't let them trample on your rights. So he was very concerned with places where he thought the police or lawyers or judges had overstepped the mark, and that everyone had the right to be represented. Even poor people on legal aid had the right to not have their rights infringed upon. So I think he was called in on the recommendation of someone. And at that time, there hadn't been a kidnapping in New Brunswick in living memory. So it would be an interesting thing to do.
And you talk about him a little bit. He kind of always was idealistic. He was one of those guys who grew up and he always wanted to change the world. That was just something that he grew up wanting to do, right?
Well, idealistic and ambitious. Right. The idea, I'm going to find, and also politically ambitious. He was very involved in the Liberal Party. He was, at one point, my uncle said that, he thought he would be premier. He had friends in all the right places. So if one way as a young lawyer to make their mark is to take on a difficult case and win. And there's certainly, when you look at the whole history of legal aid defenses, or even pro bono legal defenses of poor people accused of murders, it's often the most prestigious lawyers that take that on for free as kind of a way to give back to the community, but also to enhance their own reputation as someone who's very fair. Because the defense of someone accused of a crime, the free defense of them is the cornerstone of the democratic legal system. Everyone has the right to a defense. And he so fervently believed that. And I think at the beginning, he would have thought they don't have the evidence, or perhaps even it's not true. And he would have gone in with a very high idealism that he certainly didn't have on the other side.
And when he shows up, even just to the police station and starts figuring this out, it seemed at the beginning, and maybe I read it wrong, but it seemed at the beginning, a lot of people understood he's a defense attorney. He is going to do what he needed to do. When it started, even with the intense pressure that they were on with the missing police officers, it seemed like they understood that this was his job, this was his thing. They respected that. But that kind of seemed to change over time, right? As everything starts unraveling and things start to come out, people start personalizing it, and he becomes a real target that he doesn't necessarily start out as, right?
Well, I think it changes pretty quickly. So when he first gets there, it's okay. And even in the second day, it's okay. But all the police officers were also involved in the search, and they were all sleeping. At that time, the police station was below the jail. And so the police officers had full access to the jail upstairs at any time. And they were all sleeping there kind of on the floor, and they were all drinking. And so what was happening was they were taking Ambrose into different offices and beating him up, taking turns to interrogate him. And by the third day, one of those police officers held a gun to my dad's head and was crying and threatening him. And it took my dad a long time to talk him down. And I think I know who that is, but I'm not exactly sure. And certainly that person is now gone. I could never ask them. But it became personalized very quickly when the policemen weren't being found, and they thought that Ambrose had the answer and just was not telling them.
Did you ever find evidence that your dad was going to back down out of this? Was there anything written, anything said that he got into it and thought, this might be over my head, I need to step back?
No. And if you look at the actual evidence, it was all circumstantial evidence, and even the forensic evidence, the chain of evidence was not upheld. They were handing things over, like in cars, leaving stuff in people's trunks. It was all in paper bags. So now we would look at that, and this would not be enough evidence in a capital case to convict. And of course, this is a time when there's still capital punishment in New Brunswick. But because there was so much circumstantial evidence, and because community feeling was so strong against them, and because the judge let in some things that he was later chastised for upon appeal, it might have gone his way. I think he still had hopes up until the end that the jury would not convict, but they did. And I don't think he was ever bitter about the conviction. And he certainly felt he did the best job. Even the judge at the trial said he had done a good job, and the judge at the appeal said he had done a good job. And even the Supreme Court recognized that they had had a great defense, which for someone who had no experience doing a murder trial must have been pretty validating.
This still bothers me about the crime because I can't put it together myself. And people need to read the book, so maybe they will. It just still doesn't make sense to me that the same two men who were nice to a grandmother, who treated the kid well, even though, they had kidnapped him. So big caveat there. But then all of a sudden they turn around and within the very same time frame, they cold-bloodedly murder two police officers. As you're looking through that, did that bother you too? Like, I'm just reading it. I'm like, I know certain things say that this is what happened, and that's what makes the most sense. But that question right there of how did they go from this to this bothered me throughout the book.
Well, I'll say for myself, I was not surprised by that. Because my own field of expertise is homicide investigation, you wouldn't believe the horrible things that people are capable of. So that part didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how logistically they did it, because both of the murderers were very small men. 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", maybe 160 pounds. And the two policemen were big, 220, very fit, like trained policemen. How did they overpower both of them and get them into the car and to get them to this second site where they had taken them? Because then they had to change cars and somehow get them out to the woods. And that's another thing about the trial that was never explained. The prosecution put forward no theory about how any of that was done.
there was a lot of things where, and you see this with a lot of like actual true crime that's been done, is I know that I've read a few books and at the end of it you say, yeah, they probably did it. But if I was on the jury, could I say guilty, right? If I had to do the whole beyond a reasonable doubt, this is one of those that would be tough for me because as you said from day one, and you laid all throughout the book, there are things that point to them, but there is nothing that says that's them. And to kind of lead to kind of the last portion of this, because there's the postscript here, which is, you've mentioned it, really, really bad police work.
Yes.
I'm thinking about, evidence that shows up later that apparently wasn't there before, and no one knows where anyone is. I mean, these two police officers ended up dead because of just some horrible decision makings by the leadership in the police department, right?
Well, and I guess that's the part that also interests me as a historian in homicide investigation is what were the steps in policing? What were the mistakes made? And then ultimately, how was the Moncton Police Force reformed later? So what did they try to do to fix this later? And there's part of the book about kind of the aftermath. For myself, I obviously never had any doubts that they were guilty. And certainly the fact that they never took the stand in their own defense would have, I think now, it's hard to say what they advised my dad to do because, of course, there's no record of that or what he advised them to do. But the fact that they had no defense at all really spoke against them, as well as the newspaper coverage that published pictures of them. And I've talked about them. At last, people can sleep in the beds because these murderers have been arrested. Well, there's no proof that they're murderers. You shouldn't be calling them that before they've even been charged. So there was all kinds of court of public opinion things that affected not only the trial, but also my dad personally, that he was ostracized and, shunned in the community because he was representing these men, which was assumed that they were the murderers.
And you dive into this in a way that I think I really commend you for the way you went about it, because you talk about that your dad wasn't necessarily a father of the year for a lot of the time as you were growing up. But I also felt that there was a daughter talking about how she loved her dad, even though sometimes he made it extremely difficult to do so. When you look back on it, was it being ostracized? Was that what kind of sent him? Because he went from what seems like one type of person and it made him a completely different type of person. Do you think it was the stress got to him too? Do you think it was just being ostracized? Or do you think it was just a lot of things hit him at once and it just changed him?
Well, speaking as someone who is older now than he was then, I think he went through a lot of terrible things at once. And when that happens to someone, it's very difficult to bounce back. And if every aspect of your life has fallen apart, your marriage, his parents died shortly after this, so your family is gone, and you don't want to go back to your profession, you don't find a meaning in your profession anymore, like what do you have left? I think he was very disillusioned about the ideals he had gone into this case with and how that worked out for him. He kept those ideals throughout his life. And I think the thing that I learned through doing this research is it made me admire him in a way that I hadn't before, because he took a stand to protect someone and to uphold the law for them at a terrible cost to himself. And he could have backed out. He could have handed over the defense to someone else. But even after it went to the appeal and they had hired other lawyers, he was still involved in the case and he was still doing what he could for them. Not because he thought they were innocent, but because at that time he didn't want them to die under capital punishment. He wanted to save Ricky Ambrose's life from being killed by police, and then he wanted to save them from being executed because he didn't believe in capital punishment. So here's someone who gave up a big piece of his life to help other people, even if they weren't worthy of help, right? And that's the whole point. You don't have to, just to be human means that a citizen is allowed the right to a defense and allowed the right to, live out their life. And he wanted to give that to him, even if he didn't like them personally by that point.
It may seem like I'm splitting hairs because you said it helped you, admire him. Did it also help you understand him? Could you start putting things together of that's how you got from A to B? And I mean, it feels like there's a bit of forgiveness in here too, that you seem to start to understand why he did these things and can kind of let go of them a little bit easier?
Well, I have to say, we did have a good relationship. He wasn't always the easiest, but we got along pretty well. And by the end, it was just he and I. You know, I had my own family, but my mother and my brother both died very young. So I think what it did was make me understand his secretiveness and the fact that I didn't know about this case. I mean, it was a pre-internet era, so I'd never Googled his name and like saw it. But even there was coverage of it a few years earlier when there was another police shooting, and they mentioned this famous 1974 case, but there was no mention of his name in it. So I didn't connect the dots. And the fact that he was so secretive and didn't tell people he had been a lawyer and his new friends kept all of his private life so secretive, I understood that much better. You didn't want people to know, because he ended up later in his life moving to Moncton, which is where this murder took place, where everyone still remembers this case. He didn't want anyone to remember that he was the defense lawyer, because people would still hold it against you.
And you have to think about it too. You very early on, you said he had death threats, and this is going to sound flippant, but it's not meant to. Nowadays, that's kind of thrown around because you can just type something on Twitter, a death threat. You have to remember back in the day, someone had to take time to threaten your life. They had to sit down. They had to figure out where you lived. They had to write it out. And it feels a bit more of menacingly intimate around this time frame when somebody's really out to get you and you're constantly under attack. You're not safe anywhere. And I'm sure that's just got to really tear into somebody, especially somebody who has a family around this time.
Well, and also, I mean, those threats could have come from the police community, who were very vehemently politically organizing. They were advocating for the death penalty really before they were even charged, and they're armed. And then there's also the criminal element. And at least one of these accused men was heavily involved in the drug trade. He had a lot of enemies. You know, it could have come from there. So you're in a very dangerous situation with a lot of armed people in a town where you don't know that many people, and you're living in a hotel. Everyone can see you. Everyone knows where you are. You have no security, and you have a legal aid budget. So he lost enormous amounts of money by taking on this case. So we got a hotel room, but really very little in the way of money.
I want to talk specifically about you for a second. This book, it's for anybody listening, it sounds like we've covered everything. We have not. There's a lot more in here, but at the same time, it's a short book. You have a lot in here. It's a short book. And in my review of it, I just absolutely love this. I finished it. I immediately wrote it up because there is an economy of words with the way that you write. And I'll talk about specifically about what hit me the hardest. But for you, is that just how you write? Is that something that you try to do to just kind of keep it tight, not get too wordy, and be very focused on the subject? Or, right, like, is this something you plan, or is this just how I write and this is how it comes out?
No, I'd say my academic stuff is definitely longer. I'm trying to move towards being more concise now. I think it was with this book, I had to have a lot of friends help me with drafts, friends who were professional writers, and to say, like, what should I do? And they all said, keep it tight, keep it succinct. Don't give a lot of backstory, because you have to keep that plot narrative going and the suspense going all through the book. So, like, don't digress and talk about the forensics of paint chips the way you would in an academic article and chemical structures and geek out over that, which I wanted to do, but just keep the focus on the reader, like keep them in the story, keep reminding them who people are, and keep them through to the end.
Your section on the police officer's funeral was perfect. And I would suggest to anybody who's trying to write to just look at that, because there's a lot of emotion to it, but I think it's like a page and a half from beginning to end. And that very much hooked me within this book, because as I'm reading that, I'm like, and it's just, if I can go off on a complete tangent, it's a problem with TV nowadays. It's a problem with books nowadays, is people getting in love with, I love this, so everyone else wants to hear about it. This was the antithesis of it, which is get in there, tell the story, make sure you're telling it right and respectfully, but don't linger, don't go off on tangents like I am right now. And it's really just very good. And especially with History Nerds United, one of the things I like to do is when I make a book recommendation, I try and look at somebody and say, like, well, how do you read? Right? If you're a history nerd or a really, really deep history nerd, you can read a Ron Chernow book. It'll be 1,000 pages and it'll take you a week, but you can do it. I feel like this is one of those perfect books for somebody who goes, I don't really like history that much. Maybe I'll just do this. It's like, listen, it's fast. It's good. Get in there and read it. So that's what I'm going to tell everybody. Are you okay with that? Did you want me to change anything?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, it's not really written for historians or other historians the way my other work is. It's written for people who want to remember that time or who do remember that time and to explain just one part of the story that's involved. I can't tell the whole history of the crime because I can't tell the story of the policemen's families or even the murderers' families. I've had some contact with them, but obviously it's very painful or what happens afterwards. So I tell a little bit of the story of what I know. I could never tell it from their perspective because I don't really have the authority to. So I wanted to, although I'm a historian, just really tell it from just perspective that's respectful, but really telling the story of someone who was overlooked in all the reporting and all the remembrance of it and saying, yeah, he suffered in this too. But here's another, I don't want to say innocent bystander, someone involved in the process who suffered as a result of it because of his principles.
How hard is it talking to people who live through something like this, right? Whether it's a victim's family or things like that, and you're able to talk to these people. I have to feel like it can be very difficult because you have to filter everything you say, right? You have to make sure you're not going too far or, opening something up, which you're effectively opening something up that's very hurtful. Is that difficult to have those kind of conversations, or do you find people generally kind of want to make sure that the record is straight?
I didn't find a lot of people that would talk to me. There were some people that I spoke to, also it was 40 years ago. So they either didn't think that I was the right person to talk to, or they wanted to tell their story themselves in a different way, or they didn't want to talk anymore. And in a way, I've tried to tell the story in a way that's respectful to them, at the same time acknowledging I can't know what that was like. I mean, I can be compassionate about it. I have my own story to tell and my own experience of losing a parent very young, but it's certainly not the same.
Well, listen, it's a fantastic book, but we know that there are weird people out there who don't like history or true crime. I can't fix them, but if I took one of those people who says, I don't read anything nonfiction, true crime history, that's just not for me, that's a boring thing I have to take in high school. If I sat one of those people in front of you and said, why should they read Life Sentence? What would you say?
Are you interested in finding out a secret that was hidden for 40 years and someone offered you a window into something you've never seen before and something that you hadn't really thought about before? Wouldn't you be curious about what that secret might be?
Well, Amy, it's a fantastic secret. It's a fantastic book. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Brendan. It was a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. Amy, thank you so much. Life Sentence. Trust me, people, go out and get it. It's fantastic. In the meantime, hit us up, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, listen to other episodes of the podcast. Leave us reviews if you can. 5-star ratings, please. It really, really helps. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History.